So after a quick break, let's now continue building the home section that we were working on. So I already mentioned that we were going to lay out all of these elements in the card using a grid. But how are we actually going to do that? And the first thing that comes into my attention here is that this actually is laid out like in two columns, right? So you see that here we have these two on the left side and these two parts here on the right side. And so what that means is that we have a grid which has two columns here. And so we can then put basically these two here on one side in one column and these two in another column. And all the other elements, just like this button here, this name and this image, they can then span both these columns from one side to the other side of the grid container. And so let's now quickly do that and create our two columns. And as for the rows, we can actually let CSS take care of that automatically. Okay, so we're just going to define the columns and then the rows will be put automatically in there. And so once more, we're using an implicit grid here actually. And so you're probably starting to see that this is kind of a pattern. So most of the time, we just define the columns and then let CSS figure out the rows automatically. Now that's not always the pattern, so that's not always how it's going to work, but many times that is the best practice. Okay, so very simple in this case. Grid template columns, and all we want is two columns with the same size. So repeat to 1fr. All right. Then before that's going to work, of course, we need to add display grid. And so now we're ready to see how that's going to look like. And all right, it's actually already doing what it's supposed to do. So let's now say that we want this image, this name here, and the button to span across both the column tracks. Okay, and that shouldn't be all too hard. All we have to say is grid column from 1 to -1. Right? And I'm actually going to copy this one here because it also applies to the name and to the button. Now, how are we going to do this with the button? Well, we should actually add a class here, I guess. So beside that class that it has here already, let's call it the home button as well. So home button. And so let's add that down here as well. And grid call from 1 to -1. Okay, and actually I noticed that I called this CTA for some reason, and CTA means call to action, but I think that up here I called it something else. And yeah, I called it button actually. Okay, so let's go to all of these. So I select CTA now, and then I hit Command D here in VS Code to select all of them. And then I just have to paste, and it's going to paste it in all of these 6 places. Okay, and if I check it out now, yeah, then that looks much better. So the image is already spanning here across the entire container, but for some reason the button is not. So let's check out why. And yeah, I guess I know why, because I only added this here to the last one. So of course I need to add this class to all of them. Okay. And just one more left. And yeah. Okay, so that's much better. So let's take a look at our grid here actually in the DevTools. So this one here. All right. And where is it actually down here? Well, let's inspect it. And yeah, so you see that it's spanning these 2 grid columns. Then we have this like icon here, which we still have to format. Then we have the name, and such as we specified, it's spanning these 2 columns as well. And then all of these 4 details here, they are of course just one cell, each of them. Okay, so let's now style this heart and position it up here in the corner. And so how do you think we should do that? And I think that the best way here is to use overlapping. So basically placing this grid item here on top of this image. So in this grid cell here. So right in this grid cell. Okay, so that's where I'm going to place this heart icon. So from column 2 to 3 and from row 2 to 1. Homes and yeah, here we go. So grid row, and now I have to specify all of this because otherwise the auto placement algorithm is just going to put it in column 2, 3, but not in the first row where I want it to be. So from grid line 2 to grid line number 3, just as we said before. And now let's also do the same as down here, but make it just a bit bigger. All right, if we take a look at that now, then here we go. So this is exactly where we wanted it to be. The problem is that now the image actually moved down. And that's because the automatic placement algorithm doesn't automatically put grid items one on top of another. So instead it just moves this one here down. But we don't want that to happen. We want this also to be in the first row. And so we have to specify that just as we had to do for the icon. So where is that? Yeah. So grid row from 1 to 2, please. And that should fix it. Now, just to be sure that this icon here will always stay on top of this image, let's just give each of them a z-index. And so this one, of course, will be higher. So a z-index of, let's say, 1, and the like, a z-index of 2. Okay, and it worked even without that, but just to be 100% sure, and also to show you that this is how we define which of the elements should be placed on top of the other. Now, just one more thing here with the like is this here, so it's not aligned here to the right side as we want it to be. And how do we align grid items inside of grid cells horizontally? We just use the justify items property, right? But in this case, we want this to happen only with this one here. And so we can use justify self on this exact item. So justify self is going to align the item inside the grid cell, and we want it to be all the way to the end. So here we go. Now it's here all the way to the end. Now just one more thing. Let's just give it some margin here. So to push it down and right a little bit. So margin 1 rem, and with that we should be good to go. All right, so that looks much better. Next up, we have this name of the house. And so that is how this looks like. So how are we going to do that? Well, first up, let's style this element and take care of placing it afterwards. So we're talking about this one here, the name. And so let's start with the font family. And this one is the display font. And so I'm using that variable name here. The font size is 1.6 rem. I want the text to be aligned at the center. It should have some padding of 1.25 rem. And the background color of color secondary. So that's or a dark blue. Then the color itself is white. And the font weight 400. So I'm doing all of this very quick and very fast without explaining much because you're already familiar with all of this, and that's not really part of the CSS grid anyway. Okay, so that's the main style, and so let's now think about the more difficult stuff. Well, for some reason nothing really happened. Let's see why that is. And it's probably because of this error here. So let's give it a save again, and then yeah. Here we go. So how do we now go from looking like this to what we have here? So basically the width of this item here is not 100%, but just 80%. Then all of this here is centered in the grid cell, and then it's also moved up a bit. Okay, so let's take care of the first things that I said. So first off, the width is only 80%. And then it is horizontally aligned inside of its grid cell. And that's pretty easy. So once again, we're going to use justify self, and this time set to center. So that's really easy, right? So that's how it looks like right now. And now all we have to do is to place it here, kind of here in the middle. Okay, and we have two options for that. The first one is to move it up from here, but then that would create like this half empty row here, right? So basically we would have one row which would be half empty, and then half of it would be occupied by this element. And I don't think that's really perfect, and so instead what I'm going to do is to place this grid item here right in this first row. So basically putting it here into this first row, so here on top of the image. So using overlapping once again. Alright, so I already defined the grid column. Let's also define the grid row. 1, 2, and let's define a z index as well in order to ensure that it's going to be on top of the image. So how does that look like? And whoa, it's stretching all the way from the top to the bottom of this grid cell. But that's of course not what we want, and so we have to vertically align it here to the bottom. And so we already used justify self, and for this one we're going to use align self. And to the bottom, right? So justify self and align self are pretty similar, with the difference that justify does it horizontally, and so in the row axis, and align does it vertically, and therefore in the column axis. Okay, and so that should fix that, and for some reason it didn't, and that's because it's not called bottom, but it's called end instead. Okay, so let's take a look at that in the DevTools. And alright, so here it is, all the way to the end of this grid area. And now it's just very simple, we just have to move it down with a simple translate. So transform, translate in the y direction 50%. Because 50% corresponds to 50% of the height of the element itself. And so it's going to place it exactly at the center. And here we go. So that is the result that we were looking for. So I hope that you understood the reasoning about it, so why I did it the way that I did. And I thought this was a cool way of showing you why some of these properties like justify self or align self are really important to know all the time and have always in mind whatever situation we face when we build our layouts. Now, of course, we need some more space here. So this is now actually overlapping this icons here and this row, of course. And so let's just create some space between the rows. Okay, and that is actually pretty easy. We just need the grid row gap. So where is that? Gap. And I'm going to go with 35 pixels here. So again, this was here obtained through experimentation, and I settled here on this value. So I thought this was the best. Now this still looks rather strange. So you see that the space here between this home name and then this row here is not quite as we want it to be, right? And that's because we moved this here down, and so we created this inequality here, right? So let's see that a bit better here. Yeah, so you see that we have actually these 3.5 rems here, here, and here, but then we have like this overlapping. And it would be amazing if CSS Grid allowed us to style some of these gaps individually. So what I would like to do now is to say that this first gap here should be like 5 or 6 rem, and the others should only be 3.5 rem. But unfortunately, that's just not possible with CSS Grid at this point. And I don't know if that's going to change in the future, but right now, when we specify the gap in the grid, it will be the same for all the rows and for all the columns. So we cannot style just one gap individually. And so we just have to come up with a solution for that. And the solution that I found is to add a small margin to the top of these two items. So the house location and the house rooms. So if we add a margin to the top of these two, then that will increase basically the space between this name and then this next row. So that is again not ideal, it's not perfect, but we have to come up with solutions like this from time to time. And in fact, it works perfectly fine in this situation, doing it like this. Okay, so let's copy this from here. And at a margin top of 2.5 rem. And if we check that out now, then that actually looks a lot better. And you can see it even better here over here. And yeah, so that's the best solution that I could come up with at this point. Another solution would have been to say that the second row here should be a bit higher than the others, and then move these two here down to the bottom of this row. But I think this way it's actually better. It's a bit cleaner. Okay, so not interfering with the individual height of these grid rows. Okay, and so we're now actually almost done with this grid. All we have to do is to apply some simple styles here to each of these four characteristics of the homes. So let's do that, and let's set the font size at first. And actually we can do it right here. So font size 1.5 rem, and then the text is going to inherit it, and so I don't even need this selector here. Next up, I want to give each of these four details a margin to the left side of 20 pixels, so 2 rem. And so that's how it's going to look like then. And so all that's left to do now is to actually put these two elements here side by side. And what's the best tool for that job? Well, I strongly believe that Flexbox is the way to go here. So Flexbox is really perfect for this really small stuff. And even if we start using CSS Grid for almost everything one day, I think that for this small alignment stuff, Flexbox is always going to be the easiest and most straightforward solution, because it's really as simple as that. All we have to do is to really say display flex, and then they will be two side by side. Okay, and even better, what we can do is to say align items and center. And so we will also vertically center these two items along the cross axis, right? So basically vertically. And so that looks even better now. And all of that with just two very simple lines of code. Now here on the icon, let's give it some margin to the right side. So in order to separate the icon from the text, so margin right 1 rem. And that's necessary because in Flexbox, there's not something like the grid gap that we have in CSS Grid. So in Flexbox, we cannot specify gaps like we can with grids. But actually, I read somewhere, I think on Twitter, that they are thinking about adding gaps to Flexbox as well. And so someday if that becomes available, then that will be fantastic. So we'll no longer have to deal with margin rights, then we could simply add like a gap here in the Flex container in order to separate the icon from the text here. Okay, but right now that's not available, but maybe someday in the future we will be able to do that. And so then it's even simpler. Okay, and I think that's actually it. I think that's the design we were going for. And yeah, I think it looks exactly the same, in fact. So that's awesome. That's great progress from you up until this point. We're building more and more complex layouts here, using more and more advanced techniques. And so we're already mixing CSS Grid with Flexbox and using some advanced placement techniques as well. So I hope that this is really useful for you, so that you can build your own designs sometime in the future using all of these powerful techniques.